For centuries, the armies of Al-Andalus ruled Iberia, their banners flying high over ancient Roman cities, their scholars and merchants reshaping the land. The great caliphs of Cordoba presided over Europe's wealthiest and most advanced civilization. Yet, in the remote mountains of the north, an ember still burned. The last remnants of the Christian Visigoths, scattered and leaderless, were about to strike back. And so began an 8th century war that would define the fate of a continent. This is Reconquista. When the Western Roman Empire fell, it was the Visigoths, a people who had once been nearly enslaved by Rome, who settled in Spain and established their own kingdom. Unlike the Romans, their rule did not bring economic prosperity. Infrastructure collapsed, the economy shrank to subsistence levels, and cities fell into decline, as pointed Thomas Glick, American historian, in his book Islamic and Christian Spain in the Early Middle Ages, which presents comparative history of the Islamic and Christian areas of Spain in the period between AD 711 and 1250, when these areas emerged as distinct political, social, and cultural entities. But the Visigoths still ruled in the early 8th century when a disastrous civil war happened. In 711 AD, an army led by the Berber general Tariq ibn Ziyad crossed the Strait of Gibraltar. At the Battle of Guadalete, place unknown today, King Roderick of the Visigoths was betrayed by his own vassals. His army was annihilated, and Visigothic Spain collapsed almost overnight. Within just 10 years, almost all of Iberia was under Muslim rule, incorporated into the powerful Umayyad Caliphate. To the new Muslim rulers, Iberia, now called Al-Andalus, was a paradise. Historian Brian A. Catlos, in his book Kingdoms of Faith, writes that aside from the rainy, mountainous fringe of the north, Iberia's geography bore a strong resemblance to North Africa and the Middle East, fertile, sun-baked, and primed for agricultural wealth. However, in the mountains of Asturias, Christian resistance was stirring. In 718 AD, or 722 AD, according to some sources, a Visigothic noble named Pelayo made a desperate stand at the Battle of Covadonga. Though vastly outnumbered, his small band of warriors used the treacherous mountain terrain to their advantage, inflicting a stunning defeat on a Muslim force. Historians debate the historical accuracy of Covadonga, as Muslim sources don't even mention it. But as Joseph F. O'Callaghan, Professor Emeritus of Medieval History and former Director of the Center for Medieval Studies at Fordham University, and one of the leading historians for the period, puts it in his book, Reconquest and Crusade in Medieval Spain. Whether exaggerated in Christian memory or not, Covadonga was the first spark of resistance, proof that the Muslim conquest was not absolute. From Asturias, the seeds of the Christian Reconquista were planted. For over 2 centuries after Pelayo's victory at Covadonga, the Christian kingdoms of Iberia did not thrive, they merely survived. The reality of the early Reconquista was not one of rapid Christian expansion, but of small, isolated kingdoms clinging to existence in the mountainous north. Muslim Al-Andalus was still the dominant power, economically, culturally, and militarily. Yet, slowly but surely, the foundations of Christian resurgence were laid. This was a period of defensive consolidation, the gradual emergence of Leon, Castile, Navarre, and Aragon, and the beginning of a Christian counter-offensive that would culminate in the fall of Toledo in 1085. The early Christian states were fragmented and weak. Historian Hugh Kennedy, who we extensively cited in our previous videos, emphasizes in his book Muslim Spain and Portugal that Asturias was so isolated and economically backward that it could hardly be considered a kingdom at all. Unlike Al-Andalus, which boasted sophisticated irrigation systems, bustling cities, and a wealthy trade network, Christian Iberia was a rugged, undeveloped frontier. But why did these kingdoms survive? The answer lies in two key geographical factors: the Cantabrian Mountains and the Pyrenees. These rugged landscapes created natural barriers against Muslim incursions. The Romans had once struggled to control these lands, and now the armies of Al-Andalus found them just as inaccessible and inhospitable. The desert of the Duero, between the Christian kingdoms and Al-Andalus, lay a vast, sparsely populated buffer zone known as the Duero Valley. This was a no-man's land, too dangerous for settled life, but perfect for raiding and guerrilla warfare. The Asturian kings, realizing their precarious position, expanded cautiously, consolidating their hold over the northern strip of Iberia. Under King Alfonso II, r. 791 to 842, Asturias was transformed from a loose collection of warlords into an organized kingdom. He even relocated the capital to Oviedo to strengthen his hold over the region. By the early 10th century, Asturias had evolved into the Kingdom of Leon, its rulers pushing southward into the Duero Valley. Ordoño II of Leon, r. 914 to 924, and Ramiro, the second ruler, 931 to 951, began mounting larger raids into Muslim territory. The first major Christian victory at the Battle of Simancas, 939 AD, the most significant moment of this period was the Battle of Simancas, 939 AD, where King Ramiro II of Leon defeated Caliph Abdurrahman III of Córdoba. This was the first time that a Christian kingdom decisively defeated a major Muslim army on the battlefield. Bernard F. Riley was a pioneering scholar in the modern field of medieval Spanish history. In his book, The Contest of Christian and Muslim Spain, he notes that Simancas shattered the illusion of Muslim invincibility, proving that Christian forces could stand against the power of Córdoba following Simancas. Leon expanded further south, capturing strategic cities like Salamanca and Zamora. But Leon itself was fragile. Internal rivalries and succession crisis weakened the kingdom, leading to a new power emerging from within its own territory: Castile. Originally just a small county on Leon's eastern frontier, Castile was a harsh, lawless land. Its name literally means land of castles, a reference to the countless fortifications built to defend against Muslim and Christian rivals alike. Under Count Fernán González, reigned 931 to 970, Castile began to act independently from Leon. González took advantage of Leon's internal struggles, consolidating his control and forging Castile's identity as a militarized, fiercely independent state. By the mid-11th century, Castile had grown in power and would soon become the dominant Christian kingdom. Castile's leaders adopted a more aggressive frontier mentality than Leon, relying on constant warfare and fortification building. The population of Castile grew through repopulation efforts, as Christian settlers were encouraged to move southward. Unlike Leon, Castile's rulers were less tied to Visigothic traditions and more focused on practical military expansion. Historian Richard Fletcher, in his well-known book The Quest for El Cid, argues that Castile's rise was a product of war, where constant border conflicts shaped its militaristic culture. While Leon and Castile fought for supremacy, two other Christian states emerged in the east: Navarre, a kingdom founded by the Basques, fiercely independent and skilled in mountain warfare. It became a key player under Sancho III, the Great, ruled from 1004 to 1035, who expanded Navarre's influence over Leon, Castile, and Aragon. Aragon, originally a small Pyrenean county, Aragon grew under the influence of Navarre. Under Ramiro I, ruled from 1035 to 1063, it became an independent kingdom and slowly expanded southward. The eastern kingdoms benefited from their ties to France, as French knights and nobles frequently assisted them against Muslim forces. This would later become a key factor in the spread of Crusader ideology into the Reconquista. The greatest turning point for the Christian kingdoms came in 1031, when the mighty Caliphate of Córdoba we covered its history in depth in our last video, link is in description below, collapsed. For centuries, Córdoba had been the undisputed power in Iberia, economically, politically, and militarily. But now, Muslim Spain, fragmented into dozens of rival Taifa kingdoms, each fighting for survival. How did this help the Christians? The Taifa states were militarily weak as they fought amongst themselves. They began paying tribute, parias, to Christian kings in exchange for protection. This influx of Muslim gold helped fund Christian armies and accelerate the Reconquista. Historian Joseph F. O'Callaghan explains that the Christian kings were less concerned with immediate conquest than with making the Taifa rulers their tributaries. This quote was taken from his book, Reconquest and Crusade in Medieval Spain. This led to the most significant conquest yet. In 1085, King Alfonso VI of Castile-Leon captured Toledo, the former Visigothic capital. This was a monumental victory, not just for Castile, but for all of Christian Spain. Toledo was the first major Muslim city to fall into Christian hands. It was a psychological and symbolic turning point, proving that the Reconquista was no longer just about survival. It was now about reclaiming lost lands. Hugh Kennedy in Muslim Spain and Portugal describes Toledo's fall as a dagger thrust into the heart of Al-Andalus. However, this success brought unintended consequences. The weak Taifa rulers, desperate for help, called in the Almoravids from North Africa. These were militant Berber warriors who would halt the Christian advance and bring new levels of religious fanaticism to the war. The Reconquista was about to enter its bloodiest phase yet. By the end of the 11th century, the balance of power in Iberia was shifting. The Christian kingdoms of Castile, Leon, and Aragon had moved beyond mere survival and had begun aggressively expanding southward, taking advantage of the political fragmentation of Al-Andalus. But this period of Christian dominance would not last. The Muslim rulers of Al-Andalus, facing collapse, called for aid from across the Mediterranean. Their desperate appeal would unleash two of the most powerful North African Islamic dynasties in history, the Almoravids, 11th century, a warrior sect of Berbers who arrived to stop the Christian advance and briefly reunified Muslim Spain. The Almohads, 12th century, an even more radical and powerful movement that would nearly crush the Christian kingdoms before suffering a catastrophic defeat at Las Navas de Tolosa in 1212. For over 150 years, these fanatical North African dynasties would turn Iberia into one of the fiercest battlegrounds of the medieval world. After the fall of the Caliphate of Córdoba in 1031, Muslim Spain fragmented into dozens of rival Taifa states, each ruled by local kings, emirs. The problem: the Taifas were politically weak and constantly at war with one another. Instead of uniting against the Christians, they often hired Christian mercenaries to fight their Muslim rivals. The solution? Paying off Christian kings. Many Taifa rulers, knowing they couldn't defeat the Christian kingdoms, began paying tribute, parias, to Castile and Leon. These massive payments of gold, silver, and luxury goods funded Christian armies, accelerating the Reconquista. Everything changed in 1085, when King Alfonso VI of Castile-Leon captured Toledo, the most important city in central Iberia. Joseph F. O'Callaghan describes Toledo's fall as the first major territorial loss for Muslim Spain since the initial conquest, Reconquest and Crusade in medieval Spain. Faced with the real possibility of complete Christian domination, the desperate Muslim rulers of Seville, Badajoz, and Granada turned to North Africa for help. They invited a powerful Berber dynasty, the Almoravids, to cross the Strait of Gibraltar and defend Islam. Who were the Almoravids? The Almoravids were a Berber warrior sect from the Sahara Desert. They had built a mighty empire across North Africa, stretching from Morocco to Ghana. They followed a strict interpretation of Islam, viewing the Taifa rulers of Al-Andalus as corrupt, weak, and unworthy of rule. Their leader was Yusuf ibn Tashfin, a brilliant general and ruthless ruler. Yusuf and his highly disciplined army of 15,000 Berber warriors landed in Iberia. In October 1086, they met Alfonso IV's Castilian army at the Battle of Sagrajas, also known as Al-Zalaka, meaning slippery ground. The result was a massacre. The Christian army was annihilated. Hugh Kennedy writes that Sagrajas was a catastrophic defeat, demonstrating that Christian expansion was far from inevitable. Muslim Spain and Portugal. What was the impact of that bloody battle? Christian expansion was stopped in its tracks. The Taifa rulers, though initially grateful, soon realized that the Almoravids were here to stay. In 1090, Yusuf deposed the Taifa rulers and absorbed Al-Andalus into his empire, reunifying Muslim Spain for the first time since Cordoba's fall. At first, the Almoravids stabilized Al-Andalus. They fortified cities, strengthened armies, and brought religious discipline. Among their other achievements were restored Muslim military power in Iberia, prevented further Christian conquests for nearly 50 years, built fortresses and strengthened defenses, turning cities like Seville and Granada into military strongholds. Derek W. Lomax, an important British historian in his book The Reconquest of Spain from 1978, notes that, for a time, the Almoravids re-established Muslim power in Spain, but their harsh rule alienated many Andalusians. However, the Almoravids were not invincible. Over time, their brutal taxation and religious extremism turned the local Muslim population against them. In 1147, a new enemy emerged, the Almohads, an even more radical movement from Morocco. Who were the Almohads? The Almohads were a fundamentalist Islamic movement from the Atlas Mountains of Morocco. Unlike the Almoravids, who were strict but pragmatic, the Almohads were zealots. They believed in absolute religious purity, persecuting not only Christians and Jews, but also Muslims they deemed unfaithful. The Battle of Alarcos, 1995. Christian defeat. The Almohads invaded Iberia, and in 1995, under Caliph Abu Yusuf Yaqub al-Mansur, they devastated the Castilian army at the Battle of Alarcos. Richard Fletcher was a British historian who specialized in the medieval period. In his book, Moorish Spain, he describes Alarcos as one of the most humiliating defeats in Castilian history, exposing the fragility of Christian power. What was the impact? Christian advances were reversed. Castile and Aragon suffered heavy losses. The Almohads strengthened their grip on Al-Andalus, imposing strict Islamic rule. By 1200, it seemed like the Reconquista might fail entirely, but the Christian kingdoms would not surrender. A powerful coalition of Christian forces was gathering, leading to one of the most decisive battles in medieval history. By the end of the 12th century, the Christian kingdoms of Iberia were facing their greatest crisis since the early days of the Reconquista. The arrival of the Almohads, a militant North African dynasty, had reversed Christian gains and brought Iberia back under strong Muslim rule. The Battle of Alarcos, 1995, had been a catastrophe. Castile suffered a devastating defeat, and the Almohads, under Caliph Abu Yusuf Yaqub al-Mansur, crushed Christian resistance. Many feared that the Almohads, who had reunified Al-Andalus, might finally put an end to Christian rule in Iberia. But instead of surrendering, the Christian kingdoms of Castile, Aragon, and Navarre forged an unprecedented alliance. Their leaders turned to Rome, framing the war as a crusade against Islam. The response was overwhelming. Knights from across Europe answered the call, and in 1212, at the Battle of Las Navas de Tolosa, Christian forces delivered a blow from which Muslim Spain would never recover. By the early 13th century, the Almohads ruled one of the largest empires in the Mediterranean. Their empire stretched across North Africa, Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, Libya, and Al-Andalus, Muslim Spain. Who were the Almohads? The Almohads were an ultra-conservative Islamic movement that had overthrown the previous rulers of North Africa, the Almoravids, in the 1140s. Unlike the Almoravids, who had ruled with some tolerance, the Almohads enforced a strict version of Islam and viewed both Christians and Jews as infidels who had to be either converted, expelled, or killed. Brian A. Catlos, in his book Kingdoms of Faith, notes, the Almohads saw themselves as religious reformers, tasked with purifying Islam. In doing so, they alienated much of their own population, particularly in Al-Andalus, where Jews and Christians had lived relatively peacefully for centuries. By 1195, under Caliph Abu Yusuf Yaqub al-Mansur, the Almohads had reached the height of their power. After their crushing victory over Castile at Alarcos, Christian leaders feared the complete collapse of the Reconquista, but internal struggles were weakening the Almohad state. The Caliph Yaqub al-Mansur died in 1199, leading to succession crises. Almohad rulers were forced to spend more time in North Africa, fighting rebels and keeping control of their vast empire. In Al-Andalus, local Muslims began to resent the Almohads' harsh rule, secretly hoping for Christian intervention. This was the perfect moment for a Christian counterattack. In 1212, King Alfonso VIII of Castile, still recovering from the humiliation of Alarcos, sent an urgent request to Pope Innocent III, asking for a crusade against the Almohads. The Pope's response: a papal bull for Iberia. Pope Innocent III declared a holy war against the Almohads, granting the same spiritual rewards given to crusaders fighting in the Holy Land. Christian rulers across Europe were urged to send troops to Iberia. Massive numbers of French Knights Templars and Hospitallers signed up for the campaign. Why was this significant? Before this, the Reconquista had been largely a regional war between Iberian Christians and Muslims. Now it was seen as part of a global struggle, a war as important as the Crusades in Jerusalem. Joseph F. O'Callaghan writes, the Reconquista was no longer just about Iberia. It became part of a broader Christian effort to reclaim all lands lost to Islam. Reconquest and Crusade in medieval Spain. The coalition that formed was one of the largest Christian armies ever assembled in Iberia. Who fought at Las Navas de Tolosa? King Alfonso VIII of Castile, the main leader of the campaign, seeking revenge for Alarcos. King Pedro II of Aragon, a powerful ally with strong French support. King Sancho VII of Navarre, a Basque warrior king who would play a key role in the battle. Portuguese and Leonese knights. Though the kings of Leon and Portugal refused to participate, many of their nobles and military orders joined anyway. French and European crusaders. Thousands of knights from France, Italy and Germany arrived in Castile. Total Christian army size, estimated 50,000 to 60,000 men. Total Almohad army size, estimated 60,000 to 75,000 men. Key difference: the Christian army was unified under one cause, while the Almohads were fighting on multiple fronts, with many of their forces stationed in North Africa. Hugh Kennedy explains, unlike the earlier battles of the Reconquista, Las Navas de Tolosa was a highly coordinated, strategic campaign. The Christian kingdoms had learned from their mistakes, Muslim Spain and Portugal. With their army assembled, the Christians marched south, deep into Almohad territory. The battlefield near Despeñaperros Pass, central Spain. The Almohads had dug defensive trenches and fortified their camp, expecting a long siege. Richard Fletcher writes, the Almohads had chosen their battlefield wisely, blocking the Christians' advance with steep cliffs and rugged terrain, Moorish Spain. Phase 1 of the battle, the Christian attack, begins. Castilian heavy cavalry launched a frontal assault, attempting to break the Almohad lines. Almohad archers and cavalry counterattacked, pushing them back. The battle stalled. It seemed like a repeat of Alarcos. Phase 2. The breakthrough. King Sancho, 7th of Navarre, led a shock assault with his elite troops. They stormed a key fortified hill, breaking through the Almohad defensive walls. Seeing their defenses collapse, the Almohads panicked and retreated. Final outcome: a devastating Almohad defeat. The Christian army destroyed the Almohad forces, killing thousands. The Almohads fled south, abandoning their strongholds in Spain. Caliph Muhammad al-Nasir barely escaped back to Morocco, humiliated. Simon R. Doubleday, in his book The Wise King, describes the battle as the moment where Muslim dominance in Iberia was irreversibly broken. Aftermath. The Reconquista accelerates the results of Christian victory. The Almohads never recovered. Their empire collapsed within 50 years. Córdoba fell in 1236. Valencia fell in 1238. Seville fell in 1248. By 1250, Muslim rule in Iberia was reduced to a single kingdom, Granada. Derek W. Lomax concludes, after Las Navas de Tolosa, the Reconquista was no longer a question of if, but when. The reconquest of Spain. The Christians had broken the back of Muslim Spain. The year 1492 stands as a defining moment in Spanish history. It was the year that marked the culmination of nearly 800 years of struggle between Christians and Muslims in the Iberian Peninsula. With the fall of Granada, the last Muslim stronghold in Spain, the Reconquista came to its final conclusion. But this was more than just a military conquest. It was the birth of a united Spain, a moment that reshaped not only Iberia, but also the entire world. The story of Granada's fall is one of war, diplomacy, betrayal, and a kingdom's desperate attempt to hold on to power against an enemy that had become too strong. It is also the story of the Catholic monarchs, Isabella of Castile and Ferdinand of Aragon, whose vision for a unified Spain was realized through a decade-long siege that would push the last remnants of Muslim rule off the European mainland. For more than 2 centuries, the Emirate of Granada had survived in the shadow of growing Christian kingdoms. But the forces that had once allowed it to thrive, its wealth, its stronghold in the mountains, and its ability to pay tribute, were no longer enough. By the late 15th century, the world had changed. Christian Europe was on the rise, while the Islamic world was divided and weak. The fall of Granada was no longer a question of if, but when. Granada had not always been the last Muslim kingdom in Spain. 200 years earlier, the Iberian Peninsula was home to many independent Muslim Taifa states. But after the fall of Córdoba in 1236, Valencia in 1238, and Seville in 1248, Muslim rule had been reduced to a single kingdom, the Emirate of Granada. Ruled by the Nasrid dynasty, Granada had managed to survive through a combination of political cunning, economic strength, and military defense. The Sierra Nevada mountains provided a natural barrier against Christian armies, while the Alhambra, the stunning palace fortress that dominated the city, stood as a symbol of Muslim power in Spain. But above all, Granada survived because it played the game of diplomacy well. Its rulers had for centuries paid tribute, parias, to the Christian kingdoms, offering gold, silk, and luxury goods in exchange for peace. This wealth allowed Granada to maintain a lavish court culture filled with poets, architects, and scholars at a time when the Christian kingdoms were still forging their identities. Brian A. Catlos notes, Granada was not just a political entity. It was a cultural masterpiece, a fusion of Islamic, Christian, and Jewish traditions that had flourished in Iberia for centuries, kingdoms of faith. But this fragile existence could not last forever. By the late 15th century, the balance of power had shifted decisively in favor of the Christians, and the rulers of Granada knew it. The final blow to Granada came not just from superior military power, but from a political marriage that changed the course of history. In 1469, Isabella of Castile and Ferdinand of Aragon were married, uniting the 2 most powerful Christian kingdoms in Spain. Before their reign, Christian Iberia had been divided, with different kingdoms often fighting one another instead of focusing on the Muslim enemy to the south. But with this marriage, Spain became a single, unified entity, determined to complete the Reconquista. Joseph F. O'Callaghan writes, "The union of Castile and Aragon was more than a political alliance. It was the birth of a new Spain, one that saw itself as the champion of Christendom, Reconquest, and Crusade in medieval Spain." For Isabella and Ferdinand, the conquest of Granada was not just a military goal, it was a divine mission. They framed their war against the Nasrids as a holy crusade, a final push to remove Islam from Spain once and for all. They refused to continue the traditional system of allowing Granada to pay tribute in exchange for peace. Instead, they made it clear, Granada must surrender or be destroyed. The war began in 1482. Unlike previous campaigns, this was not a series of isolated raids, but a coordinated military effort that involved thousands of troops, the latest siege technology, and the full backing of the Catholic Church. The war unfolded in three key phases. Phase 1, the Christian advance, 1482 to 1487. The Catholic monarchs began their campaign by capturing key fortresses surrounding Granada. Their first major victory came in 1486, when they took Loja, a crucial defensive outpost. But the biggest blow came in 1487, when the Christians besieged Malaga, Granada's most important Mediterranean port. After months of brutal fighting, Malaga fell, cutting off the Nasrids from their supply routes to North Africa. Hugh Kennedy explains, with the loss of Malaga, Granada's fate was sealed. Without access to the sea, it could no longer sustain itself for long, Muslim Spain and Portugal. Phase 2, the Siege of Baza, 1489. Baza, another major Nasrid stronghold, fell after an 8-month siege in 1489. With this victory, Ferdinand and Isabella had isolated Granada, leaving it as the last Muslim city in Spain. Phase 3, the final siege of Granada, 1491 to 1492. In late 1491, the Christian army surrounded Granada itself. The siege was merciless. The Catholic monarchs built an entire town, Santa Fe, outside the city walls, ensuring a permanent military presence. Richard Fletcher describes the siege as a war of patience. Ferdinand and Isabella knew that Granada could not hold out forever. Moorish Spain. By December 1491, Emir Muhammad XII, Boabdil, saw no way out. His city was starving and his people were losing faith. He surrendered on January 2nd, 1492, handing over the keys to the city. According to legend, as he rode away from Granada, Boabdil wept, prompting his mother to say, "You weep like a woman for what you could not defend as a man." The consequences of Granada's fall, the end of Islamic rule in Spain. After 781 years, Muslim rule in Iberia was over, the expulsion of Jews and Muslims. In 1492, Isabella and Ferdinand issued the Alhambra decree, forcing all Jews to convert or leave Spain. In 1502, the same fate awaited Muslims. The Spanish Inquisition begins, a tool used to ensure religious purity in Spain, targeting suspected heretics. The Age of Exploration. Just months after Granada's fall, Christopher Columbus set sail, leading to Spain's rise as a global superpower. Derek Lomax writes, 1492 was the moment when Spain emerged as a world empire, fueled by the conquest of Granada and the discovery of the New World, the reconquest of Spain. The Reconquista was more than just a war. It was a struggle for identity, power, and the future of Spain. The fall of Granada ended one of the longest conflicts in world history, shaping the religious, political, and cultural trajectory of Iberia for centuries to come. Brian A. Catlos states, "The Reconquista was not just the end of Muslim Spain, it was the beginning of a new global Spain, kingdoms of faith." With Granada's fall, Spain turned its eyes to the Atlantic. The war for Iberia was over. For centuries, the Reconquista has been portrayed as a heroic and righteous struggle between the Christian kingdoms of Iberia and the Muslim rulers of Al-Andalus, a grand, centuries-long crusade in which the forces of Christendom pushed back the armies of Islam. But was it truly a holy war? Did the kings of Castile, Leon, Aragon, and Portugal genuinely see themselves as warriors of faith, fighting to reclaim Spain for Christianity? Or was the Reconquista primarily a dynastic and territorial conflict, where religion was used as a convenient justification for warfare, conquest, and expansion? This question has been debated by historians for decades. Some argue that the Reconquista was an extension of the Crusades, a divinely sanctioned war to expel Islam from Iberia. Others suggest that it was a much more complex process, shaped by political ambitions, shifting alliances, and the practical realities of medieval power struggles. To understand the true nature of the Reconquista, we must examine how religion shaped both Christian and Muslim narratives, how the Church and the papacy influenced the wars, and whether the rhetoric of Crusade matched the reality of war on the ground. The Christian rulers of Iberia certainly framed the Reconquista in religious terms. From the early chronicles of the 9th and 10th centuries, Christian kings were portrayed as defenders of the faith, striving to restore a land that had been lost to Muslim invaders. This idea was particularly powerful in Castile and Leon, where the memory of the Visigothic kingdom, overthrown in 711, lingered in historical writings. Joseph F. O'Callaghan explains, Christian kings and chroniclers consciously shaped the narrative of the Reconquista as a struggle between the forces of Christ and the forces of Islam. They depicted the kings of Leon and Castile as successors to the Visigoths, the rightful heirs to Spain, and the Muslim rulers as usurpers, Reconquest and Crusade in medieval Spain. This idea of the Reconquista as a restoration rather than a conquest became central to the Christian identity in medieval Spain. In their view, Spain was not being conquered from the Muslims, but reclaimed. However, despite this religious rhetoric, many Christian rulers were just as willing to make alliances with Muslim leaders when it suited their needs. Kings of Leon and Castile often accepted tribute, Parias, from Muslim Taifa rulers, taking gold in exchange for peace. At times, they even hired Muslim soldiers to fight against their Christian rivals. Hugh Kennedy argues the reality of medieval Iberia was far more complex than a simple Christian-Muslim struggle. Alliances frequently crossed religious lines. Christian kings were willing to fight alongside Muslim rulers when it benefited them, just as Muslim emirs sometimes allied with Christian kings against other Muslims, Muslim Spain and Portugal. This suggests that while religion was important, it was not the sole driving force behind the Reconquista. The wars were just as much about political power, territorial expansion, and economic gain as they were about faith. The Pope and the Catholic Church played a crucial role in shaping the idea of the Reconquista as a holy war. The earliest religious justifications for the war emerged in the 11th century, when Pope Alexander II granted the first Crusader indulgences for Christian knights fighting in Spain. The turning point came in 1095, when Pope Urban II launched the First Crusade to reclaim the Holy Land. Around the same time, he extended the idea of crusade to Iberia, encouraging knights from across Europe to join the war against Andalus. Derek Lomax describes this shift. From the late 11th century onwards, the language of crusade became intertwined with the Reconquista. Christian rulers in Spain increasingly presented their wars as part of the larger struggle against Islam, aligning themselves with the crusading movement, the reconquest of Spain. By the 12th and 13th centuries, the papacy granted full crusader status to warriors who fought in Spain. Just like those who fought in Jerusalem, knights who joined the Reconquista received spiritual rewards, forgiveness of sins, papal protection, and even guarantees of eternal salvation. The Battle of Las Navas de Tolosa in 1212 was the peak of this crusading fervour. Pope Innocent III formally declared it a holy war, and knights from France, Italy and Germany joined the campaign. Richard Fletcher states, the victory at Las Navas de Tolosa was not just a military triumph, but a religious one. It was seen as proof that God had willed the Reconquista to succeed. Moorish Spain. However, while the Church promoted the idea of crusade, this does not mean that all Christian kings saw themselves as purely religious warriors. They accepted papal support when it was useful, but they were ultimately driven by their own ambitions. In the 13th century, after Castile and Aragon had conquered most of Muslim Spain, the Pope wanted them to continue their crusade into North Africa. They refused. This suggests that once their political goals had been met, the crusading cause lost its appeal. While Christian rulers saw the Reconquista as a divinely ordained mission, how did the Muslim rulers of Al-Andalus view the conflict? For much of the early Reconquista, Muslim chroniclers did not see Christian advances as a religious war, but rather as a continuation of political struggles that had existed since the fall of the Caliphate of Córdoba. Taifa rulers were often more concerned with fighting other Muslim rulers than with resisting Christian attacks. However, this changed with the arrival of the Almoravids in the 11th century and the Almohads in the 12th century. These North African dynasties framed their wars in Spain as a jihad, a religious struggle against Christian forces. Simon R. Doubleday writes, "The Almoravids and Almohads brought a new sense of religious purpose to Al-Andalus. They portrayed the Christian advances as an existential threat to Islam itself and called upon all Muslims to resist in the name of faith." The wise king. This shift in perspective meant that by the 12th and 13th centuries, both sides, Christian and Muslim, were using the language of holy war. The Reconquista had become not just a political struggle, but also a deeply ideological one. So was the Reconquista a holy war? The answer is not simple. On one hand, religion was an essential part of the ideology of the war. Christian rulers used the rhetoric of Crusade to justify their expansion, while Muslim leaders invoked jihad to resist them. The papacy granted indulgences, and knights from across Europe joined the fight. But on the other hand, the reality of the Reconquista was far more complex than a simple Christian versus Muslim struggle. Political ambition, economic motivations, and shifting alliances played just as large a role as religious faith. Brian A. Catlos summarizes, "The Reconquista was neither a pure holy war nor a purely political conflict. It was a centuries-long struggle in which faith and power were inseparably intertwined, shaping the destiny of Spain and the world beyond. Kingdoms of faith." Ultimately, the Reconquista was both a war of faith and a war of empire, a war where religious ideals and earthly ambitions were fused into one. The Reconquista was a war of faith, power, and identity, shaping not just Spain but the entire medieval world. It was a story of alliances and betrayals, triumphs and defeats, shaping the destiny of Iberia for centuries. But this is just one chapter in the larger saga of medieval history. Subscribe for more. If you love epic medieval history, deep dive storytelling, and historically accurate analysis, then make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss an episode. Join the discussion. What do you think? Was the Reconquista truly a holy war, or was it more about power and politics? Let us know in the comments below. We read and respond to as many as we can. Like and share. If you found this video insightful, don't forget to like the video and share it with fellow history enthusiasts. The more people join our journey, the better. History is more than just facts. It's the story of us all. Let's keep discovering it together.